Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight,
commuting her sentence was entirely appropriate.
In his final news conference, President Obama addresses the controversial decision to release Chelsea Manning and his role in a new era of politics. Then the Senate takes on a whirlwind of confirmation hearings, grilling the president-elect's picks for the next cabinet, and building a greener form of energy. How progress on fusion nuclear technology could be the future of our power.
Our great-great-great-grandkids are going to live in a world powered by fusion, almost exclusively.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. He's given his final major speech, and now President Obama has also held his final news conference. He spent an hour before the White House press corps today, 2 days before his presidency ends. John Yang was there.
In his 22nd and final time facing reporters in the White House briefing room, President Obama today defended his decision to commute the sentence of Chelsea Manning, the former Army intelligence analyst convicted of leaking U.S. military and diplomatic secrets.
Chelsea Manning has served a tough prison sentence. So the notion that the average person who was thinking about disclosing vital classified information would think that it goes unpunished, I don't think would get that impression from the sentence that Chelsea Manning has served.
Most of the news conference was spent looking ahead to the fate of his own accomplishments after President-elect Trump takes office.
My working assumption is that having won an election opposed to a number of my initiatives and certain aspects of my vision for where the country needs to go, it is appropriate for him to go forward with his vision and his values. And I don't expect that there's going to be enormous overlap.
He also shed light on the counsel he's offered Mr. Trump.
This is a job of such magnitude that you can't do it by yourself. You are enormously reliant on a team. Your cabinet, your senior White House staff, all the way to fairly junior folks in their 20s and 30s, but who are executing on significant responsibilities. That's probably the most useful advice, the most constructive advice that I've been able to give him.
He said he hoped he could take a pause from politics, but made clear he'll speak out when he feels compelled to.
Certain issues or certain moments where I think our core values may be at stake. I put in that category if I saw systematic discrimination being ratified in some fashion, efforts to round up kids who have grown up here and for all practical purposes are American kids and send them someplace else, I think would be something that would merit me speaking out.
And he weighed in one last time on an issue that's dogged presidents for generations, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
If you do not have two states, then in some form or fashion you are extending an occupation. We believed, consistent with the position that had been taken with previous U.S. administrations for decades now, that it was important for us to send a signal, a wake-up call, that this moment may be passing.
Mr. Obama also reflected on how America has changed during his presidency on social issues, like attitudes on LGBTQ rights.
I don't think it is something that will be reversible because American society has changed. The attitudes of young people in particular have changed. That doesn't mean there aren't going to be some fights that are important, legal issues, issues surrounding transgender persons. There's still going to be some battles that need to take place.
The president lamented what he sees as undue restrictions on voting rights, which he said was a lingering vestige of slavery and Jim Crow.
This whole notion of election or voting fraud, this is something that has constantly been disproved. This is fake news. The notion that there are a whole bunch of people out there who are going out there and are not eligible to vote and want to vote. We have the opposite problem. We have a whole bunch of people who are eligible to vote who don't vote.
As Mr. Obama, the nation's first black president, prepares to leave office after the first female presidential nominee was defeated, he expressed confidence that more barriers will be broken in the future.
If, in fact, we continue to keep opportunity open to everybody, then, yeah, we're going to have a woman president, we're going to have a Latino president, we'll have a Jewish president, a Hindu president. Who knows who we're going to have? I suspect we'll have a whole bunch of mixed up presidents at some point that nobody really knows what to call them.
Once he becomes a former president, Mr. Obama says he's looking forward to writing, being what he called quiet. He said he doesn't want to hear himself talk quite so much in the future, and also being a consumer of news rather than the subject of news. Judy?
John, I also thought it was interesting that the president acknowledged the role that economic inequality played in the results of the election.
That's exactly right. He spoke about that in the context of a question about inclusion and diversity. He said it's important for all Americans to feel a part of the growing economy. He said he thought there were a lot of people who voted for Mr. Trump because they felt forgotten and disenfranchised and looked down upon.
Now, John, you had a busy day because I know before the president's news conference you attended a briefing by the Trump transition team, and they were talking about getting ready for the inauguration.
That's right. Sean Spicer, who's going to be the press secretary here at the White House on Friday, starting on Friday, said that Mr. Trump has been rehearsing his inaugural address. He said that he wrote it himself with some input from policy advisor Stephen Miller, from Kellyanne Conway, from Reince Priebus, who's going to be White House chief of staff, from Steve Bannon, who's going to be White House counselor. He said that it's going to talk about common goals and Mr. Trump himself has said that the theme is going to be America first. Sean Spicer was asked if any part of the speech is going to reach out to Americans who didn't vote for Mr. Trump. He said that Mr. Trump doesn't feel he should be judged on his rhetoric or symbolism, but wants to be judged on his actions and his successes.
All really interesting. John Yang, keep holding down the fort for us at the White House and with the Trump transition team. Thank you. Well, this was a day for Team Trump also to talk health and the environment at 2 Senate committee hearings. The health secretary-designate, Tom Price, defended his investments in medical stocks and played down talk of overhauling Medicare. And Scott Pruitt, nominated to run the Environmental Protection Agency, says that he does not believe climate change is a hoax, as the president-elect has suggested. We'll have full reports on all that after the news summary. Regarding climate change, there is news that global temperatures hit a record high in 2016 for the 3rd straight year. The data is from NASA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the British. They say the average last year was more than 1.5 degrees higher than in the mid-20th century. They say it was caused by man-made greenhouse gases and an El Nino effect. The nominee to be the next ambassador to the UN says Russia committed war crimes in Syria and cannot be trusted. South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley offered a harsher assessment today than Mr. Trump has at her own Senate hearing.
Russia is trying to show their muscle right now. It is what they do. And I think we always have to be cautious. I don't think that we can trust them. I think that we have to make sure that we try and see what we can get from them before we give to them.
Haley also blasted a UN resolution last month that condemned Israeli settlements, and she voiced support for moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the nominee to run the Commerce Department, Wilbur Ross, put China on notice today. The billionaire investor told his confirmation hearing that the Chinese are, quote, the most protectionist country among the major economies.
They have both very high tariff barriers and very high non-tariff trade barriers to commerce. So they talk much more about free trade than they actually practice. We would like to levelize that playing field and bring the realities a bit closer to the rhetoric.
Ross also said the Trump administration will focus on renegotiating the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement very early on. Separately, the Senate Armed Services Committee easily approved the nomination of James Mattis for Defense Secretary. It now goes to the full Senate. In West Africa, a suicide attacker drove a car bomb into a camp in northern Mali, killing at least 60 people and wounding 115. The attack struck a base in the city of Gao, where soldiers and former rebels are trying to enforce a 2015 peace treaty. Later, an Islamist group linked to al-Qaeda claimed responsibility. In Nigeria, the International Red Cross says that at least 70 refugees and aid workers died Tuesday when the Nigerian Air Force accidentally bombed a UN camp. Military officials say they meant to hit the militant Boko Haram group. At least 46 severely wounded people remained at the camp today, near the border with Cameroon. UN officials have called for a full investigation. Iraqi government troops announced today that they've taken full control of the eastern half of the city of Mosul. The military said it drove Islamic State militants out of the last neighborhoods after a 3-month operation. Today, people cheered and took pictures with soldiers, and commanders talked of the coming operation to liberate western Mosul.
In the last few days, our forces' movements became quicker, and the clearing of districts became faster. The reason is that when they were defeated, they retreated. I think the western side will be easier to liberate from the eastern side.
Despite the military's announcement, there were reports of continued fighting in Mosul's eastern half. Back in this country, the U.S. Supreme Court will decide whether barring racially offensive trademarks violates free speech. The justices heard arguments today over a 70-year-old law. It's being challenged by an Asian American band named the Slants. The ultimate decision could also affect the National Football League's Washington Redskins. The U.S. Secret Service has agreed to pay $24 million to settle a long-running racial discrimination lawsuit. More than 100 African-American agents are part of a suit filed back in 2000. They say the agency routinely promoted whites over qualified blacks. Under the settlement, the Secret Service does not admit any wrongdoing. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 22 points to close at 19,804. The Nasdaq rose nearly 17 points, and the S&P 500 added 4. And former President George H.W. Bush and his wife Barbara are both hospitalized in Houston this evening. Mr. Bush was admitted Saturday with pneumonia, and he moved into the intensive care unit today. A spokesman says he is stable. Mrs. Bush entered the same hospital today as a precaution, they said, for fatigue and coughing. Still to come on the NewsHour, several Trump cabinet nominees face tough questioning at their confirmation hearings. The exciting yet elusive possibilities of nuclear fusion and much more. We turn now to the confirmation hearings for the president-elect's cabinet. One of Mr. Trump's most repeated pledges is to repeal and replace Obamacare, officially known as the Affordable Care Act. His nominee to head the Health and Human Services Department, Representative Tom Price, faced aggressive questioning today when he appeared before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Lisa Desjardins has our report.
When Tom Price, doctor, congressman, and hopeful health secretary, today faced the Senate Health Committee, the spotlight fell equally on the fate of the Affordable Care Act he wants to repeal and on Price's own history. Senator Patty Murray launched a Democratic theme.
You purchased stock in Innate Immunotherapeutics, a company working to develop new drugs, on 4 separate occasions between January 2015 and August 2016. You made the decision to purchase that stock, not a broker, yes or no?
That was a decision that I made, yes.
Price stressed that other health stocks he owned were chosen by his broker. The questions arise from his financial disclosures, showing Price invested in health-related companies in the past 2 years as he pushed legislation in Congress that benefited those companies.
Your purchases occurred while the 21st Century Cures Act, which had several provisions that could impact drug developers like innate immunotherapeutics, was being negotiated. And again, just days before you were notified to prepare for a final vote on the bill.
Price insisted those bills were consistent with what he's done for years, and that while he did get a private stock offer, he had no special knowledge of the company.
I had no access to non-public information.
Minnesota Senator Al Franken pointed to a recent Wall Street Journal report, finding that Price traded more than $300,000 of health-related companies while simultaneously working on policy affecting those companies.
These sound like sweetheart deals, and I think that our job in this body and in Congress and in government is to avoid the appearance of conflict. And boy, you have not done this.
The exchanges moved from calm to tense. Price pushed back, insisting he would never use his office for financial gain.
What I did was comply with the rules of the House in an ethical and legal and above-board manner and in a transparent way.
Republican Orrin Hatch called the Democratic push for an investigation hypocrisy, pointing out no rules in Congress prevent stock trades.
In fact, there are members on this committee who have, as I understand it, who have traded individual health stocks while serving on this committee. Now, this appears to be nothing more than a hypocritical attack on your good character.
Thank you, sir. Everything that we have done has been above board, transparent, ethical, and legal. And as you know, and the members of this committee know, there's an organization that's called the Office of Government Ethics that looks at all of for every cabinet nominee, looks at all of the possessions, all the holdings and the like, and makes a recommendation as to what that cabinet member must do in order to make certain that there's no conflict of interest. The Office of Government Ethics has looked at our holdings and given advice about what would need to be done in terms of divesting from certain stock holdings.
As part of the nomination ethics process, Price has pledged to divest from 43 companies, including those that Democrats raised, within 90 days of his confirmation.
I think some of the things that have occurred with the passage of the ACA have improved certain areas. The coverage is certainly improved. But the consequences of that, I mean, that many people, as I mentioned before, have coverage, but they don't have cares. I think the more involvement that patients and families and doctors can have in medical decisions, the higher quality care we'll have.
Mr. Price, who practiced as an orthopedic surgeon for more than 2 decades, proposed his own detailed plan last year, offering some tax credits and repealing the Medicaid expansion. To him, that means less government interference. But to Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Democrat, it means cuts to needy populations.
What we believe is appropriate is to make certain that the individuals receiving the care are actually receiving care.
I understand why you think you're right to cut it. I'm just asking the question, did you propose to cut more than $1 trillion out of Medicaid over the next 10 years?
You have the numbers before you.
Mr. Price insisted that a Republican replacement plan would ensure widespread access to care.
My role in Congress was to always make certain that individuals had the opportunity to gain access to the kind of coverage that they desired, and that they had the financial feasibility to do so.
But access, Senator Bernie Sanders said, is not the same as coverage.
I have access to buying a $10 million home. I don't have the money to do that.
Price next goes before the Senate Finance Committee on Tuesday.
Scott Pruitt also took his turn in the hot seat today. If confirmed, he would be the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And the president-elect has said he wants him to reverse 8 years of what he calls President Obama's environmental policies. Democrats wanted to see just how far he plans to go. Jeffrey Brown has that story.
As the hearing began, Democrats focused on today's announcement from NASA scientists that the Earth had seen record temperatures for a 3rd straight year. This exchange followed.
Donald Trump has called global warming a hoax caused by the Chinese. Do you agree that global warming is a hoax?
I do not, Senator.
So Donald Trump is wrong?
I do not believe that climate change is a hoax.
But in his opening statement, Scott Pruitt had an important caveat.
Science tells us that the climate is changing, and then human activity in some manner impacts that change. The ability to measure with precision the degree and extent of that impact and what to do about it are subject to continuing debate and dialogue, and well, it should be.
Pruitt made clear he does believe strongly in states' rights and said he'd work to return the federal watchdog to what he considers its proper role.
Federalism matters. It matters because Congress says so. And because we need to achieve good outcomes as a nation for air and water quality, we need the partnership of the states to achieve that. It is our state regulators who oftentimes best understand the local needs and the uniqueness of our environmental challenges.
As Oklahoma Attorney General, Pruitt filed 14 lawsuits against the EPA and an array of Obama administration environmental rules. And in the past, he said he'll work to repeal the president's centerpiece climate regulation, cutting carbon emissions from power plants. Today, several Democrats raised concerns over the health ramifications.
We've had children die in New York City because none of their teachers, no administration in their schools knew what to do when a child has an asthma attack. It's a huge problem. So I need you to care about human health and really believe that the cost when human health is at risk, when people are dying, is far higher than it is the cost to that polluter to clean up the air and change their processes. I need you to feel it as if your children sitting behind you are the ones in the emergency room. I need you to know it.
And Senator, I would say to you, there are certain instances where cost can't even be considered, as you know. Those criteria pollutants under our NAAQS program, cost is not even a factor because human health is the focus.
We don't want the EPA done!
Environmental protesters interrupted the proceedings several times. One was forcibly removed into the hallway. At various points, some Democrats showed their irritation at what they saw as Pruitt's vague responses. For their part, though, Republicans praised Pruitt for his work in Oklahoma, including his handling of a dispute involving poultry industry runoff into the Illinois River. Pruitt negotiated a deal and ordered further study, ending the legal fight. Democrats pointed to campaign contributions Pruitt had received from poultry company officials. But Republicans focused on what they see as economic harm and bureaucratic barriers raised by the EPA. Republican Senator Deb Fischer of Nebraska.
As a result of the activist role the EPA has played for the past 8 years, families are concerned about the futures of their livelihood. What steps will you take as the EPA administrator to provide relief for American families that are faced truly with an onslaught of EPA rules?
It's very important that that process be adhered to give voice to all Americans in balancing the environmental objectives we have, but also the economic harm that results. And the Supreme Court has spoke about that rather consistently of late, and I would seek to lead the EPA in such a way to ensure that openness and transparency.
Scott Pruitt is expected to be confirmed by the full Senate with support from all 51 Senate Republicans. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown.
We also want to follow up on the confirmation hearing for the president-elect's pick for Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. Last night, we told you about some of her ideas, but after our broadcast, we learned more as her hearing continued into the evening. When pressed, she said she would not rule out using public funds for private schools. She also seemed opposed to free tuition for community college. She was asked about her commitment to civil rights for students who are LGBTQ and past contributions to groups that are opposed to same-sex marriage. She also faced a tough exchange from Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut on whether guns should be carried on school campuses.
One final question. Do you think that guns have any place in or around schools?
I think that's best left to locales and states to decide. If the underlying question is...
You can't say definitively today that guns shouldn't be in schools?
Well, I will refer back to Senator Enzi and the school that he was talking about in Wapiti, Wyoming. I think probably there, I would imagine that there's probably a gun in the school to protect from potential grizzlies.
If President Trump moves forward with his plan to ban gun-free school zones, will you support that proposal?
I will support what the president-elect does, but Senator, if the question is around gun violence and the results of that, please know that my heart bleeds and is broken for those families that have lost any individual due to gun violence.
I look forward to working with you, but I also look forward to you coming to Connecticut and talking about the role of guns in schools.
DeVos was also asked repeatedly about how she would enforce the disabilities law for education. At times, she did not seem certain about some of the law's provisions. Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a Democrat and the former vice presidential nominee, led off this exchange.
Should all schools that receive taxpayer funding be required to meet the requirements of the individuals with disabilities in education?
I think that is a matter that's best left to the states.
So some states might be good to kids with disabilities and other states might not be so good, and then what, people could just move around the country if they don't like how their kids are being treated?
I think that's an issue that's best left to the states.
Okay, let me state this. I think all schools that receive federal funding, public charter or private, should be required to meet the conditions of the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. Do you agree with me or not?
I think that is certainly worth discussion, and I would look forward
to. So you cannot yet agree with me?
That was at DeVos's hearing last night. So let's wrap up all of this with a look at where things stand for the Trump cabinet. And for that, we're joined once again by the NewsHour's Lisa Desjardins on Capitol Hill. So, Lisa, there's also news today about President-elect Trump's pick to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget.
That's right. Someone not even with a hearing today is making the headlines. That's Representative Mick Mulvaney of South Carolina. We now know that Representative Mulvaney in the early 2000s failed to pay taxes for one of his household employees. It was a babysitter, a child care provider for he and his wife's 3 triplets. At the time, Mulvaney disclosed this information to the Senate Budget Committee about a month ago, we're told, and he has since paid some back taxes, about $15,000. He's waiting for the bill from his state as well. Of course, I don't need to tell our viewers this is significant because issues like this have completely scuttled nominations for others, including also another former member of Congress, Tom Daschle, who was the nominee for HHS Secretary, and also Zoe Baird under President Clinton, who was a nominee for Attorney General. You know, we are not hearing anything yet from Senate Republicans. Senate Democrats are going after this very strongly. I did talk to Senator John McCain, who is the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and he told me he thinks this is fairly serious.
So, Lisa, one other thing. You were telling me earlier that there are some pretty serious negotiations going on right now between the Democratic and the Republican leaders in the Senate over the order that these nominees will have a confirmation vote.
That's right. And specifically, how many of these cabinet secretaries are confirmed on day one? We know that is something that President-elect Trump has been measuring, and we know that he's been looking at President Obama's number, which was 7 confirmations on day one. Right now, Judy, it doesn't look like he'll come close to that. In fact, Democrats are negotiating over whether they will allow any nominees to be confirmed on day one. They can hold up a nomination over the course of a single day or more, and they're talking about the doubts they have and the problems they have with, they say, the way these confirmation hearings have been rushed through. Republicans say that's not fair and they want the same treatment that the Obama nominees received. I think what's important to watch for, Judy, is especially the defense and homeland security positions. Those are the most important to Republicans. We'll see if any of those are confirmed on day one. Those are all of that is in the air even just 2 days out from inauguration.
A lot to follow. Lisa Desjardins. Lisa Desjardins, thanks very much.
January 20th, 2017, the inauguration of Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. Day one of a new era. Join PBS NewsHour for live coverage and analysis you won't find anywhere else. Friday, January 20th at 11 a.m., 10 Central. Only on PBS.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, an entirely new level of gridlock in New York City surrounding Trump Tower, and the importance of treating health problems over long periods of time. But first, the effort to create fusion energy. While many people remain worried about pursuing further development of nuclear power, some researchers believe nuclear fusion could hold the key to clean and plentiful energy. There have been many false starts before, but some scientists see real reason for hope that this path will eventually pay off. Miles O'Brien has the report for our weekly segment, The Leading Edge, a co-production in this case with Nova and his special, The Nuclear Option.
In Southern California, this complex, power-hungry machine is hard at work on a seemingly quixotic mission, akin to catching lightning in a bottle. It is a plasma generator. Its builders hope it is a key step in the long journey to the holy grail of energy production, fusion.
Fusion is nature's preferred way of making power.
Michael Binderbauer is Chief Technology Officer for a startup called Tri-Alpha Energy that is making a $500 million bet on fusion.
Think of this like a mini sun, a very hot mini sun, and it radiates. And it's that radiation that's intercepted on the surface of the machine and then becomes heat, and then you can process that into electricity.
The promise? No less than limitless power, with virtually no greenhouse gases or radioactive waste. If that sounds too good to be true, it is. No one knows that better than nuclear engineer Steve Dean.
Fusion is not low-tech. It's not going to be easy to prove that it's reliable, maintainable, cost-effective, because it is complicated.
Dean is president of Fusion Power Associates, a foundation focused on research and education. He joined the fusion industry in 1962, working with the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, which coordinated and funded the U.S. fusion effort.
To me, it seemed like it was something I could spend my career on, and we would have electricity on the grid by the time I retired. That's what I thought. So it didn't happen that way.
Fusion is as old as the cosmos. It is the nuclear reaction that takes place in our sun and all the other stars in the universe. In a fusion reaction, hydrogen atoms collide at high speed, fusing together, forming a helium atom, releasing one neutron. Since the mass of the helium atom is less than the combined mass of the two atoms that collided in the first place, energy is released. The dawn of man-made fusion broke over the Pacific in 1952 with the first explosion of a hydrogen bomb.
The hydrogen bomb was a quick success. And so derivative of that was euphoria that a few more years we could do civilian energy production out of fusion. And while there were glimmers of hope along the way, we all know painfully that hasn't happened.
In the 1950s and 60s, researchers looked for ways to control, confine, and sustain fusion so that it could be used as an energy source. They tried newly invented lasers, a U.S. design called Stellarator, and then a Russian design called Tokamak, a big circular racetrack that uses powerful electromagnets to suspend and accelerate particles, prompting fusion-generating collisions. Over the years, they have gradually answered many of the questions.
Right now, there are still physics issues that have to be proven, but the physics is very well known. The only thing that isn't known is when you do something that's a little bit more closer to a power plant, whether it's something new will show up in the physics. You can't really predict that.
That's what this huge project is all about. It's the biggest tokamak ever designed, under construction in France, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, a joint project of 35 nations, including the U.S. It is the first engineering test of a fusion power plant. ITER is a $14 billion endeavor that is 6 years late and $10 billion over budget. It is designed to one day use 50 megawatts of electricity to generate 500 megawatts for 15 minutes.
At some point, in order to get to a power plant, you have to build what we call an engineering test reactor, or something that really works, that's putting out lots of fusion energy and has a lot of the engineering that's needed for a power plant. And ITER and the tokamak is the only track that's at that stage.
3, 2, 1, 0.
But there is a lot of fusion progress on a smaller scale.
Oh, there was a plasma.
Teams in Germany, China, and South Korea have recently reported longer sustained fusion reactions than ever before. Tri-Alpha is the largest of about a dozen startups trying to make it work.
We partner up with some of the best and brightest in the field.
Michael Binderbauer began his work in academia, but believes the private sector might have a better chance of success.
It made us lean, it made us focused, it made us an organization that was nimble to react to small changes quickly and think on our feet very quickly. And I would attribute part of our success to exactly that.
And they're also building on many more years of physics understanding and progress. And so they can be smarter now Whereas in the past, a lot of times their ideas were interesting, but there wasn't any physics basis for having confidence.
The fundamental fusion problem is it is not easy to get nuclei to collide and fuse. They are all positively charged, so they naturally repel each other, like two magnets.
So we use magnetic fields to provide that magnetic bottle, if you will, into which you put the charged clouds of particles. The gas wants to escape and distribute out, and we're holding that in with magnetic force. This is not like how it's done in the sun, where you have massive gravity that does the same job. So here it's all electromagnetic fields.
It takes a lot of energy to create those magnetic fields. In fact, the real challenge in fusion is creating plasma that generates more energy than it takes to make it in the first place. Historically, scientists have opted to go big, like ITER.
One event makes a very small amount of practical energy. You have to have billions of these events. That means you have lots of these things happening in a large volume.
Tri-alpha is taking a different approach that would not require such a huge structure. The idea is to fire two football-shaped plasma clouds at each other at supersonic speeds. At the center of the chamber, they collide violently, fusing into a larger football. Additional particles are fired at right angles, making the plasma ball spin like a well-thrown pass.
The particles always come in like this, and they go into the rotation of the main object. So it feeds in like this to maintain that rotation rate.
The rotation suspends the plasma in place.
Charging.
They are testing constantly, sometimes 50 times a day. Each shot requires about 20 megawatts of electricity.
Trigger.
Enough to power all the lights and appliances in 5,000 homes, but only for a few thousandths of a second. Gleaning data from a hot ball of nothing that lasts for much, much less than the blink of an eye requires a lot of clever testing tools.
Ultimately, physics is an experimental science, right? And as such, it relies on hardcore evidence coming out of an experiment. At the stage where we are at, we're dabbling fine line between learning what works and tweaking that and advancing in another step.
Binderbauer believes a commercial fusion system will be available in a decade.
Our great-great-great-grandkids are going to live in a world powered by fusion, almost exclusively.
But industry graybeards like Steve Dean are less willing to make such predictions. After all, fusion energy has remained decades away for many decades.
Is it inevitable in your view? It's just a matter of time.
I think it's just a matter of time. I used to say in my lifetime, then I started saying in my children, and now I think before it's a wide-scale use, it's being at least my grandchildren. I can't predict.
Right now, we do not have an energy crisis to spur the effort, but we do have a climate crisis. Fusion remains an alluring, yet still elusive way to power the planet the same way nature does. Miles O'Brien, the PBS NewsHour, Foothill Ranch, California.
With just a couple of days left until the inauguration, much of the nation's attention is on President-elect Trump's move into the White House. But Midtown Manhattan residents are still focusing on the gold skyscraper of Trump Tower, which will continue to be a home for the Trump family. Producer Rena Natour looks at the unprecedented challenges of securing that residence and the financial fallout.
This is the new reality along the storied Fifth Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. Dogs, chains, and intense security. The president-elect has used Trump Tower as a base for transition meetings since the election. And while he will relocate to the White House after the inaugural, his wife Melania and 10-year-old son Barron plan to stay in Trump Tower through the end of the school year. Evie Pompouris is a former Secret Service agent. For 12 years, she was part of the presidential detail for Presidents Obama, Clinton, and both Bushes.
And we are seeing delivery truck after delivery truck being searched in and out. What is happening here?
So we want to control what's coming into the area of Trump Tower.
And one of the biggest issues are large vehicles that can actually have large amounts of explosives. And a truck would be a perfect thing, a perfect IED, a vehicle device to use. So what they'll do is you'll typically have the vehicle stopped. They'll search the vehicle, make sure there's nothing inside the vehicle, underneath the vehicle, make sure it's clean.
Trump Tower stretches 57 stories with 26 floors of offices, 3 retail stores, and hundreds of tenants. It is also surrounded by other skyscrapers, compounding the security challenge.
Right now, planes aren't allowed to fly over Trump Tower. Same thing that happens over at the White House. But then you have that variable. You know, he's up top, he's high on the floor. Planes are a concern.
And as technology evolves, there are ever greater risks.
Drones. Can somebody use a drone? Not just to go up there and, you know what, I want to see the future president. You can actually strap explosives, weapons to those drones, fly them up, and then cause harm in that way. And then also even cybersecurity, radiation, contamination in the air, any type of chemical airborne attack, that's also an issue. The tower itself, one of the things we look at is what we call the HVAC system, which is where the air intake system is. That's super dangerous as well.
While the Secret Service is working on threats from within the tower, the New York Police Department guards the exterior and directs traffic in the 4-block radius where the vehicles are being limited. The protective measures are causing a dramatic slowdown in business here, where the rents are among the highest in the world. Tiffany & Company reported this week that its Fifth Avenue store dropped 14% at the end of 2016, in part due to the traffic disruptions. Robert Smith runs operations for Uncle Jack's Steakhouse, which has developed a faithful following for years on West 56th Street, within view of Trump Tower. The owner was so excited by the Trump win that he named menu items after him.
We were down 20% right off the bat, right after the election. Once the security came in, barricades went up. People weren't allowed to walk into the restaurant or even near the block.
What have you been hearing from your regular customers?
Obviously, my regular clientele isn't coming in as often as they used to. I had bar clientele at lunch that would come every day that don't. We have a lot of tourists that come, very tourist central located neighborhood, and a lot of them don't even want to get anywhere near barricades and dogs and giant police bomb trucks, and it doesn't make anybody want to come near the place.
A short distance away on 6th Avenue, Jimmy Tarzi at Allen M. Jewelers says he has been losing 30 to 50% on any given week. He worries about what will happen to business if Trump returns to his penthouse residence each weekend.
You have to take precautionary measures, and, you know, I can understand that. I really do. But being the president or president-elect, you have to say to yourself, you're supposed to do for the people. Go live in Washington.
Some are calling Trump Tower White House North. Exactly how security will be transformed here is still a work in progress.
At a New York City Council meeting last week, questions on how to prepare and who should pay went unanswered by NYPD officials.
Does the Secret Service have the right to close down a street on its own?
I'm not sure.
If the NYPD were to decline to provide service in and around Trump Tower, because of cost or lack of reimbursement or whatever, what would happen then?
I'm unable to answer that question.
We have to have some idea of how much this is going to cost, because right now we're kind of just spending with an unlimited credit, really, and hoping that maybe the federal government will pay, maybe not.
The NYPD estimates that for every day the president resides in Trump Tower, it costs the city $500,000. So far, Congress has agreed to reimburse New York City $7 million for the cost of providing NYPD security to Trump Tower and the surrounding area. This is far less, however, than the $35 million the city initially requested. Councilman Dan Gorotnik, who represents the Trump Tower neighborhood, objects.
Why is New York City bearing the cost of security for the president-elect? We have some very significant businesses on Fifth Avenue that employ hundreds of New Yorkers each. And we want to make sure that these jobs and these businesses do not become a casualty of the Trump presidency here.
It's a balancing act between keeping the legendary business district humming and protecting the first family living at the heart of it. In New York City, I'm running a tour for the PBS NewsHour.
The 45th
Finally tonight, a conversation about changing the way we think about health care. In an article in the latest issue of The New Yorker, Dr. Atul Gawande, a surgeon and author, makes the case for the value of what he calls incremental medicine to deal with chronic conditions. It's the kind of medicine less heralded than that using heroic measures. William Brangham spoke with Gawande recently and asked him how health care is changing.
When you think about the future of healthcare and where we're going at this moment of debate, there's a transformation going on that involves a recognition that our focus in medicine has been on heroic interventions, like the kind that I do now as a surgeon. But the biggest gains are coming right now from incremental medicine, from a commitment to the kind of steady, overtime management of complex problems like chronic illnesses that can add years to people's lives, but that's work done by some of the people with the least resources in our healthcare system.
So who practices incremental medicine in our healthcare system today?
Well, good examples. You just look at the list of who the lowest paid people are. Pediatricians are at the bottom. You would also look at internists. You would look at psychiatrists. You would look at family physicians, HIV specialists, people who take care of chronic illnesses by seeing people carefully over time. Those are the people who get the least money. The people who have the most are people like orthopedic surgeons, interventional cardiologists. And my point isn't that, that there's something wrong with heroism. My own son has a congenital heart condition where his life was saved by cardiac surgeons stepping in at 11 days of life to save his life. But he is now 21 years old because of constant monitoring and working with him with a primary care physician and people who've controlled his blood pressure, recognized problems before they arose, dealt with learning issues that were related to his condition. And that's the only reason now that he's getting to live a long and healthy life. That's what we're not rewarding. They don't have the kind of resources and commitment that we are giving to people like me. I have millions of dollars of equipment available to me when I go to work every day in an operating room. The clinicians who keep my son going are lucky if they can have a nurse.
So if that care is so valuable, why are the incentives seemingly going in the opposite direction?
It's mainly because our health system was built at a time when we couldn't really do this kind of work. Go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, and it was the discovery of heroic interventions, the ability to cure people with a penicillin or do an operation to stop disease. That was what saved the day. Primary care physicians couldn't do all that much that really demonstrated a difference. Now, we've had the data to track people for a long time, the computational power that recognized, you know what, high blood pressure, which we didn't even know was a huge problem. We discovered it afflicts a third of all Americans, and it's our biggest killer, that years down in the future, that is our cause of everything from not only heart disease, but dementia and of kidney disease. So, the people who control and work with you to control your blood pressure, they're not rewarded for doing that or to be innovative about doing that. So the result is half of Americans have uncontrolled high blood pressure despite seeing clinicians.
The Affordable Care Act tried to move the needle in this direction, to put more incentives towards the exact kind of care that you're talking about. How successful has that been? Has that effort been?
Here's what I describe it as. We now have 30%, for example, of Medicare patients who are seeing doctors who are rewarded for doing this kind of work, which is a dramatic change from 6 or 7 years ago. So the Affordable Care Act has pushed this direction down the road. It has also offered protections that allow for pre-existing conditions, as people know, that if you have pre-existing conditions, like my son does, that you're provided coverage and you can maintain steady coverage. And that's an important part of being able to stay in care and do better over the long run.
So do you think if the Republicans and President-elect Trump go forward and repeal this, do you think that some of those incentives will stay in it, or what do you fear coming down the road?
My biggest fear, so first of all, where we are right now, 27% of Americans under 65 have an existing health condition that, without the protections of the ACA, would mean they could be automatically excluded from insurance coverage. Before the ACA, they would not have been able to get insurance coverage on the individual market, you know, if you're a freelancer or if you had a small business or the like.
Because of pre-existing conditions.
Because of pre-existing conditions. So the first thing is that the ACA protections have to be preserved, or those people get pitched out. But the big thing that's happened is in the time since the ACA has been going on, our medical science has been advancing. We have now genomic data. We have the power of big data about what your living patterns are, what's happening in your body. Even your smartphone can collect data about your walking or your pulse or other things that could be incredibly meaningful in being able to predict whether you have disease coming in the future and help avert those problems. That is the transformation that's coming. But one of the consequences of if the ACA is repealed is that all of us now are at risk of having a pre-existing condition waiting to happen. Life increasingly is a pre-existing condition waiting to happen now that we have more and more of this data available.
All right, Dr. Atul Gawande of the New Yorker magazine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
On the NewsHour online right now, as many as 200,000 people are expected to attend the Women's March on Washington the day after President-elect Donald Trump takes the oath of office. Organizers say it is a nonpartisan event aimed at a specific policy agenda. We delve into the issues driving the movement. All that and more is on our website, pbs.org/newshour. Later tonight on Charlie Rose, Charlie sits down with House Speaker Paul Ryan. And finally, a member of the NewsHour family has died. Filmmaker and cameraman John Knoop passed away last week in El Cerrito, California. In the 1990s, working with correspondent Elizabeth Farnsworth, he helped to produce and shoot more than 30 documentary reports for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour in Cambodia, Peru, and Haiti, among other countries. John Knoop was 77 years old. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. On Thursday, a Making Sense report about what life is like for middle-income people on the edge of financial ruin and their efforts to grapple with it. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening for all of us at the PBS NewsHour. Thank you and good night.
You're watching PBS.